Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Ordinance Committee of December 11th, 2007. We are here today to talk about the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance, some updates and amendments. So, who is going to lead us off here? Mr. Lamone? Ms. Baker.
Good afternoon.
It never goes away, does it? You thought you were done and then they reeled you back in, just like in a famous movie. Ms. Baker.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, and members of the Ordinance Committee. Yes, hopefully the changes today will be easy for you to understand as to how they're going to make it easier to implement the ordinance and be consistent internally. So we'll go ahead and take a look at what the recommendations are. Basically, to look at these 12 changes approximately that we've outlined in the staff report for you, the cleanup items, and then forward these to the City Council with a recommendation for introduction and adoption. So just for a brief background, of course the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance went through a great update process in the last few years, and it was adopted in City Council, those changes, May of 2007, this year. So the Ordinance Committee did take a look at the changes that were made 3 times prior to the City Council adoption. And then staff, of course, since that time has been implementing the ordinance with the public on different projects and in advising people about how to apply and so forth. So in that implementation is how we've discovered the need for these changes. And again, the purpose of the changes is not to change the meaning of the ordinance in significant ways or the intent of what was done in May. It's simply just for easier implementation by the staff and the public and internal ordinance consistency. Where there are any changes in the actual function or meaning of the ordinance, I'll definitely highlight those for you so that you'll be aware of what any particular impacts of changes would be. Just also for your information, the Single Family Design Board reviewed the changes that are before you today on December 4th. And they had just one comment, which I'll highlight for you in that part of the changes. And then the Planning Commission will be reviewing Title 28. There are 2 changes within this report that have to do with Title 28. And the way that our laws are set up is that whenever there is a change to that zoning ordinance section, that it needs to be reviewed by the Planning Commission. So they'll be focusing in on those 2 items this Thursday. Of course, we're also looking for your review on Title 28 today. So again, it's Titles 22 and 28, and PC will be looking at Title 28.
Ms. Baker, can I ask you a question as a matter of some housekeeping? Would you, since there are a number, I believe it's 12 different, not substantive, but categorical changes, would you like questions as we come upon those sections, or would you like us to wait until the end to ask the questions, since they are sort of segments in and of themselves?
Madam Chair, since we do have the time today, we're the only item on your agenda, and I think it makes sense to go ahead and address each item one by one as I'm presenting them.
So we'll break in and ask questions during that segment. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, and then again, the goal for the schedule would be to have a City Council introduction on January 15th with adoption following either a week or 2 later, depending on availability. Okay, so as you mentioned, there are 3 major change categories which together have 12 individual changes. And so we'll go through each one by one. But the major categories are, first, just to clarify which projects require design review. That's changes 1 through 5. And then the second is noticing proposals. There's just 2 changes there. And then the third major category will be the simple correction, just very minor cleanup type items. So let's go ahead and start with our first category, which is to clarify which projects require design review. And change number 1, I'll be switching back and forth to the ordinance, which is attachment 1 of your council agenda report, and explaining the change in the context of the ordinance itself. So we'll be spending some time for this first category within this Section C, building permit, single-family residential units. This section of the ordinance has basically a laundry list of items that are referred for review at the Single Family Design Board, or in some cases, if there's historic aspects of the project, it'll be going to the Historic Landmarks Commission. I think just for simplicity, whenever I mention Single Family Design Board, just know that sometimes HLC may be the case for some projects. Okay, so this first change is just to clarify that for number 1 here, this language that we've had for a very long time, a 1-story and a basement, which I'm highlighting, is going to change to instead say 2 stories or greater. And the reason for that is because our zoning ordinance actually counts a basement as a story. So this has been a point of confusion for some people, and it's also, I think, since this would actually lead to exempting certain projects that appear to be 2 stories, the way that it was written, a 1-story basement and then a story above that, sometimes, for example, the basement might be a garage that's fully exposed to the street. It would look like a 2-story project, and then the way this was written, it would actually be exempted because it would have to be taller than 1 story in a basement to be triggered. So instead, we're just following through with what the intent of the steering committee discussions were, which was that for 2 stories or more, it would be triggered for review, and acknowledging that the basement can count as a story in that 2 stories. Are there any questions or comments on this one?
Yes, Mr. House.
So how do we handle and I get the intent, so I'm not taking issue with that, but how do we handle a single-story residence that has a fully submerged basement under it? Is that a 1-story house or is it a 2-story house?
Mr. Lamont.
I think the problem is the definitions. When you look at the definition, a true subterranean basement is actually totally exempt. It's not considered a story. We'd call it a cellar. And so the definition of a cellar would not construe it as a story. So it would remain a 1-story building.
I see. I remember that distinction before. The basement, then, is any portion under the first floor that is partially exposed?
That's correct.
And a cellar
there's a
is
different
fully,
criteria of grade.
Right, I remember that, but in this case it would be an all or nothing trigger for coming in for review, so that's the reason I'm questioning. So a cellar, which is fully below grade, below ground, is it's treated as a single-story building. But a basement, which is partially exposed, would then be triggered for review at some level. Okay, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
There's actually a grade trigger with respect to the height of the floor above, but for the most part, the majority of that would be subterranean, yes.
Well, okay, I'm just trying to figure out what level of review that brings into play, and that's my question, really. What level of review happens if you have,
if it qualifies,
25% is exposed, or in this case, there's a grade and everything's underground, basically, but then you expose the garage doors or something. I mean, what threw me on this was that you said that a basement, by definition in the zoning code, is a story.
That's correct.
And that's what threw me a little bit on this, and I had never thought of a basement as a story. I did realize that we had different formulas for calculating floor area ratio, and right. There's a whole gradient there. But this
we can read you the definition of a cellar, and so you can distinguish that there is a criteria of grade.
Okay. Then in the definitions, we'll also maybe add cellar if we haven't already there, so there's a distinction between cellar and basement. That might be helpful,
sure.
too.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Vincent.
I've been, as we've been having this conversation, I turned to the definition of cellar. And cellars and basements can both have a portion of their area, their volume, above grade. The distinction is made between the cellar and a basement as to how much area is above grade to the ceiling. A cellar can have no more than 4 feet from grade to the ceiling. If it's anything more than that, the cellar then becomes a basement. The definition of a basement says that a basement is a story. So any project that has a portion of the subterranean area of the building that has a distance from grade to ceiling that is greater than 4 feet.
Greater than.
Greater than. So if it's exactly 4 feet all the way around, it still remains a cellar. If it's greater than 4 feet, that distance from grade to ceiling, it is a basement. And it's any portion of the way around that subterranean area. So that would kick it into a basement. It would then be a floor, and you would be triggering design review under the proposed changes.
Okay, good. Just a comment then, as we get towards the end of this, the idea of highlighting or calling attention to that distinction would be useful. I think the common usage of basement, people don't make that distinction. It's a term of art here. We need to make sure we call attention to that. Thank you very much.
Mr. Barnwell.
When we talk about a building height being measured from ground level to peak of the roof, is it the ground level? It's the ground level before construction. It's the natural ground level.
We actually have two triggers. It's natural or existing grade and the proposed grade, whichever is lower. That's what our new definition is in our ordinance.
Whichever is lower.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So,
and that's the point outside the building.
So a hillside lot that has nothing on it that they want to propose some new construction, and the basement/cellar proposed would otherwise be fully underneath the existing grade level, but under the new construction, the grade will be such that it will open up one wall of that to views or garage access or something, that then loses its prior definition of being below grade and is now above grade, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Moving on, Ms. Baker.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to change number 2. This is regarding another trigger, and in this case, we're talking about, I've got little hyperlinks up here, so. Okay, so this is adding a trigger. So as you can see, this is a new number 5 in the same laundry list of types of projects that would go for design review. And basically, it's just saying that if the project requires a net floor area modification, then it would need to go to design review. It is possible to design a home that, say, was a pre-existing 2-story house, and then you're adding a 1-story addition that would bring it over the maximum floor to lot area ratio, which wouldn't be triggered underneath one of the other triggers here. So we found that in order for the Planning Commission modification to be approved, there's a finding that has to be made by the SFDB or the HLC that I think it's 5 members are in support of the modification. If it doesn't go to those boards, then that finding can't be made. So therefore, we've just added this simple trigger. Are there any questions or comments on this item? No, it's fairly simple.
Not at this time.
Okay. So then change number 3. We'll go there. Okay, so this one is about walls or fences in the front yard, and the trigger was to have design review for those that were 8 feet or taller. Well, we rarely see those because in the front yard they're not allowed per other parts of the zoning ordinance. And what we're talking about is courtyard type walls usually, which really obliviate the front of the face of a building and lead to like an unfriendly street appearance. And so in this case, we were going to change the 8-foot trigger to a 6-foot trigger so that we would actually be triggering some of those projects rather than the 8-foot, which wasn't very practical. So this was just a simple mistake, and the 6 feet was what was intended.
So just let me see if I can simplify that. The current NPO, the trigger is at an 8-foot wall,
Right.
in front of the house, an 8-foot fence or wall, or not. We're not talking vegetation. We're talking structures. Well,
Right.
wood, stucco, whatever. However, the allowable height in most neighborhoods is 6 feet.
No, it's 8, or excuse me, it's
No.
It depends on which part of the front yard you're in, but yeah. So you're not going to have over an 8-foot one.
Well, my point was going to be that you weren't going to really be able to get over a 6-foot one, and so therefore the 6-foot was the actual commonsensical place to go. But you're telling me that in some circumstances you can go 8?
Yes.
And so we want to capture all of them, just not some of them? Is that why you're going to 6? Because if the norm is 6, and you want to capture all of them, then go to 6. If under some circumstances you can go to 8, well then are you allowing 6 as the norm and saying people can normally do that? But we want to look at the ones that are 8.
Now, Madam Chair, we're actually lowering the trigger threshold. Right now,
understand that.
well, we're lowering it down to 6 feet to catch more, because we realized that there were a lot of 6-foot walls that could be built without any review and create that blockage on the front.
But if 6 is allowable, why do we want to force everyone who goes to the allowed point under review? Purely
Because,
aesthetics?
yes,
Uh-huh.
yes,
As long as we know what we're doing.
yes. There are folks that object to that standard of trying to enclose the front yard of a home and create a gate sort of court complex and not have that front inviting sort of appearance to a home.
Does the 6 feet depend on the size of the lot? In other words, a 5 or a 6,000 square foot lot has the same restrictions as a 8 or 9,000 square foot lot, and therefore the size of the
Madam Chair,
neighborhood?
it has nothing to do with the lot size. It really is the location of the wall with respect to the front property line. The closer, the farther away from the front property line, the higher wall you can get from a zoning perspective. You're limited to 3.5 feet at the front property line, and as you get further back 10 feet, you're allowed to go higher.
Well,
So the
Madam
wall-
Chair, if I could, we have a specific definition of front yard, correct? Would you be giving that to us? Because I think that's one of the things that's confusing us. What is the front yard? Because the layman's term of the front yard is just like, everything in front of the house all the way to the street. But I don't think that's our definition. And so Ms. Falcone's concern here is where in the front area, from the front wall of the house all the way to the street, where is it that sometimes you do 6, sometimes you do 3.5, sometimes you do 8?
Okay.
You wanted-
Madam Chair and members of the Ordinance Committee, I've just pulled up one of our handouts that we give to the public because it is a little bit of a confusing topic, and so
Yeah, it is.
we have this for you here. It depends on if there's a driveway, for example, and those areas that the 3.5-foot height cannot be exceeded. And then also, for example, if this were the 20-foot setback that might be required, right along the front, you can't go over 8 feet here either. And then beyond the, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. Okay, so this shaded area, here's the street, this shaded area, your limit is 3.5 feet. And then it's 8 feet as you get outside this area. And then you could go even taller than that inside the front yard, it was my understanding. But like Jaime might need to clarify that
Well,
part.
which part of this are we requesting to be reviewed above 6 feet? To look at your diagram again, I'm going to start from the top and work down. The garage and the residence. From the street wall of the residence, you go some distance, and then you hit that line that runs all across the picture there, and it's called the 20-foot setback from the street. From the 20-foot setback line to the street, that is already restricted, and you can't build an 8-footer in there. Correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Councilman Moore.
But you can build a 6-footer?
If you're not creating a visibility hazard,
Okay.
and you're set back at least 10 feet back from the front property line.
And is that the area in which we want to now have this review? And are we also then including toward the house also?
That's correct.
So anything front of the house, anything, whether it's in that front yard area, or what if it's to the side?
That's not the intent in the side.
So if the wall were to cut from the front wall of the house straight over to the interior lines at an 8-foot height, no problem.
That's the side yard.
That's the side yard.
We're trying to, a visible barrier that's creating a blockage to the front entry of the home. That's
Unless
really
it's a
the,
corner, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Well, are we going to have drawings with this? How is the person going to, this was, Mr. House remembers the discussion of front yard, side yard versus interior yard, all those kinds of things end up being fairly tricky when you're trying to figure out what you're talking about. And here you're saying that, whoops, it's gone already. But here you're saying the area what do we call, let me ask you this nomenclature question. What are we calling the area from the sidewalk to 20-foot back that you have marked on there? What is that referred to as? Is that the front yard?
The required front yard setback
Okay,
area.
that's the required front yard. This thing right here talks about front yard. And so it isn't the required front yard. So again, I want to go back to the nomenclature because I think Ms. Falcone's point is an excellent one. This statement here says front yard without being specific about the difference between front yard and required front yard. Is that clear or not? I think Ms. Falcone saw it the way a lot of people would, which is what's going on.
Ms. Weiss.
Yes, I agree with Councilmember Barnwell that what we're talking about is another way, another term to use, sorry to throw another one at you, but is the remaining front yard. The way the front yard is divided now from the street is the required front yard, sometimes referred to as a setback, and then the yard remaining from the setback line to the first longest continuous wall of the main structure on the lot. The steering committee in one of the meetings, I think we all need to go back, how big a change is this? Why are we making this change? Go back to the NPO steering committee, and in one of the series of meetings, there was a discussion about this new, relatively new tendency for people to wall off their front yard. I'm not saying what part of the front yard, just the front yard. I mean, those folks weren't all worried about if it was required or interior. They're just talking about the design and the neighborhood feeling, and said, we think there should be review of walls in the front yard. Okay. So the work of the staff and the steering committee and the ordinance committee and ultimately the council was, how do we define that desire by the steering, expressed first by the steering committee, to review these walls? It became defined as an 8-foot wall, because you can't go taller than 8 without a modification anyway, but an 8-foot wall in all of the front yard. And so that's the standard, that if it is it 8 or more than 8, what does it say? 8. So if it's 7 feet 11 inches anywhere in these front yard areas, you don't go for a review specifically. But if it's 8 feet in any of these areas, you go. Well, the concern on the part of the staff, and I believe the members of the single family board that have been contributing input into this process, said the concern is there at 6 feet. This was a mistake to pick the highest point, which is what Councilmember Falcone's question is are you asking to review walls that are less than the maximum allowed? And the answer is yes. The feeling of the staff and the steering committee was that the intent, or the single family board that support this, was that the intent of the steering committee originally was to review more of these walls, and even at lower heights at the 6 foot. Now, that's the intent. There's pros and cons to that, and whether or not that makes sense that this board would review every wall regardless of the size of the lot. It doesn't relate to that. It also doesn't relate to whether or not you have a single-story or a two-story home. This is an independent trigger. If you are in a single-family zone, whatever size lot, whatever size building, small little cottage of 900 square feet, when you want to put a 6-foot wall in your front yard, wherever you can, away from a driveway, wherever it is, that would go to this board. That's what the proposal is.
If I may, one last question. Why is there a height on it? If our concern is a visual one and how the street interacts with the front elevation of the house, then we're setting up another one of these arbitrary lines, the 511 or the 61. Why do we do that? And we're also not recognizing the difference in distances. A little house is right up close, or a big house is sitting way back. But in all cases, the thought process is we're talking about that visual obstruction, and it isn't a 6-foot thing. It could be and you're measuring from natural grade too, right?
Yes.
So natural grade then begins to confuse the height of the wall insofar as it acts as a visual barrier between the street and the house. So,
I think the answer is wanting to set a threshold at which, for the most part, you're willing to let go. I mean, that's why you choose a number. At what level of wall improvement to people's property are we willing to just generally say it'll be okay without design review? And then at what level or height do you want design review? And if it's set far back and the consent reviewer or the staff sees it, it makes sense, it gets approved readily.
Okay.
If it's close to the street and it's really blocking off and changing the character of a predominantly open streetscape, then it gets more scrutiny. So those are the threshold questions for you to look at. What height? Ms. Baker tells me that the Single-Family Design Board subcommittee felt that the trigger should be 3.5 feet.
I agree. We've already got that in our ordinance.
So that's your question. It was at 8, which really you would never have design review because most fences can't go over 8.
All right, so we've clarified a number of points here. We're going to go through at the end and give our pros and cons and decisions, directions to staff after. So I have one more question on this topic, and that is if we should go with the 6-foot level or something else, but what, and that triggers design review. It triggers design review for what? Just the fence or the entire plan, landscaping, driveway, home? I mean, what are we triggering here? Review for what specifically?
Well, I think we had this discussion, Madam Chair. We are focusing on that element that is being triggered.
So if we change this today to 6 and see how that goes,
Right.
it will just be for a review of the wall in the some part of what is considered the front yard.
That's correct. That's correct. That's our intention.
Okay. All right. Mr. Vincent, and then we need to move on, please.
Yes, Madam Chair, just to clarify, we have, in some of the other triggers, you will see changes today that make that this last issue that you just raised clear, that if some of these specific triggers, if they trigger review, the only review is of the particular alteration
That
being
element
triggered.
in its singular form.
And that kind of construction will be carried forward in this trigger as well.
Okay. All right. I'd hate to open things up to some sort of massive review of things that don't have anything to do with the wall. Mr. House, and then
Well,
we do
just,
need to
now triggering review doesn't mean they can't do it. What it means is they get guidance to be sure that it's compatible and it fulfills the other requirements. So it's a way to get in. And then the first level of review would be what? Like at the lowest level of review, what would that be? Would that be in front of the whole board? Or could
No,
be,
it
could
would be a
the
staff administrative
steering
review.
office. Right.
And depending, again, on the height and location of the wall,
Judgment call
it
made
would most
there,
likely
too.
go to a consent calendar for review.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Baker.
Okay, so
Number 4.
change number 4 is regarding grading. And prior to the NPO update that was adopted this year, we had a trigger for 50 cubic yards of grading in the Hillside Design District or 250 cubic yards on infill areas to receive design review. At this point, what we have is a grading trigger in the section E here, but what staff found was the issue was that it was stating that the application had to be submitted independently without doing any other work on the site, which would require a building permit in order for the trigger to happen. So we've found that with this basically error in the ordinance, we needed to add this trigger back in that we had before, which is the 50 and the 250 cubic yards of grading, whether or not it's proposed with a building permit.
Questions? None at the moment. Oh, Mr. House.
I just wanted to comment to Connie Hannah that I'm following your letter as we go down through the thing here, and and you've identified your comments in that order, so thank you for that, and I know you'll have things to say, and it just brings me back to something that's going to seem really non sequitur, and yes, it is. A question about the number of stories on buildings that are allowable under this. There was a comment in their letter about 3-story buildings or homes. I don't recall there being an actual restriction against a three-story building. It has to be looked at in its context to really be sure that it's not, ominous and has all this other issues that we've discussed in terms of form. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, that's correct. And especially if you consider that sometimes there may be a partial basement, as we discussed, that counts as a story, and then 2 stories above that would technically be a 3-story building.
I see. Well, Ms. Hanna may want to say more about that when she comes to the mic after a while, but that was one of the concerns they had on item 1.
Right,
Thank you.
and when we were talking about basements, I want to make very, very clear that we're not calling those 3-story homes. I mean, I don't know if you get around that nomenclature, but you call it a 3-story home, but one is a subterranean story, which makes it a 2-story above ground. It's not to say we love actual 3 stories above ground in residential neighborhoods. This distinction is going to cause a lot of confusion. I just put it out there. I don't necessarily, we can talk about it during the comment period.
Madam Chair, I just want to note that we have, in fact, had proposals that involve 3 stories.
Well, that's a different kettle of fish, but someone should not be mixed in with 3 stories above ground if one of theirs is fully subterranean.
What I'm implying is that as long as the 30-foot height limit is met, one can propose 3 stories if you keep the plate heights low enough, and that's what the boards would check for consistency with the neighborhood.
Okay. Okay, let's move on then. Retaining walls?
Okay, change 5 is regarding retaining walls. And as Mr. Vincent mentioned just a moment ago, that for some of the triggers you can specify if you want that item only to be triggered and be reviewing that particular item. So here it says that if the retaining wall is triggered, that only the proposed retaining wall would be triggered. And so I think he was indicating that if you would like language similar to this for that fence item, we can copy it up to the fence item.
I think that's probably going to be recommended.
Okay.
Next.
Okay, change 6. Okay, so this one is simply a point of clarification that accessory structures can contribute to the need for a mailed notice with design review. These are our mailed notice triggers. It's a new unit. It's an addition of over 500 square feet is another trigger. And then the third is that if it would be an addition to a 2nd story or higher. And so this is simply stating that when you're counting those square footages or you're looking at that 2nd story, you also would consider any accessory structures that would require a building permit on site in the mailed notice triggers. And no comments or questions? I'll move on.
No comments or questions on that. I think you'll get plenty on the next.
Okay. Okay, so the next one is also in the noticing proposal category. This one was a steering committee suggestion that we notice the 20 closest neighbors via mail, as well as via tenant hand-delivered notices. And then what we found as staff is that we were hoping to automate the maps that we use that count the 20 closest homes and then mail it out. Well, it turned out that wasn't possible. The 300-foot radius is what we use, and it's automated. It goes very quickly with our systems computer-wise to do it that way, whereas we were having to manually create these 20 closest maps, and we didn't think that was going to be the case. So given that that is the case and it takes 15 minutes per map to create for these mailed notices, we thought it was better to just go ahead and go with the 300-foot radius, which actually in most cases gives you at least the 20 or more. It would be the very, very rare case where it would be less than 20 in a single-family infill neighborhood with small lots near it. The change of this, the impact of this would be in the hillside areas where the 300 feet wouldn't reach as far as the 20 closest homes in all cases. So this is the change that we're recommending for ease of use and implementation. The 20 closest tenant hand-delivered noticing would still occur, that this would not affect that. And so also the other aspect is the 20 closest analyses. Sometimes people get these three different things mixed up, but that would not be affected either, where they're turning in the data for the 20 closest homes. That would still be in place through our guidelines.
Okay, I'm going to ask for questions from my colleagues and ask everyone to refrain from making comments till after we've heard from the public and we're in the comment period. Mr. House.
I'm glad to hear that that last little comment about the walking hand delivered part isn't being recommended for alteration. Is there any, given what we understand about Hillside Design District, the topography changes that number of nearby homes that would be included, is there anything to prohibit us from having a broader circle in that area, say 400 feet or 500 feet or something? Would that be, because that would settle that issue pretty easily.
Madam Chair, in response to Councilmember House's question, I think the balance is by increasing this to 300 feet now, we are actually increasing noticing again. And one might think that's a good thing, but it also is generating more inquiries. And so we get to a point where ideally, if you had a smaller neighborhood with smaller lots, you'd have a variation with a smaller radius there, and as the lots get bigger, you'd have different spheres to notice. But that causes problems with consistency in trying to make sure we notice at a right distance. So our premise here is that we pick 300 feet to be consistent with all types of noticing, and we do believe that 90% of the cases will get the 20 closest homes caught. Now, we could increase that distance to 500 or a larger area for the A1, A2 zones where we have acre sites.
The larger lots.
If you wanted to. But again, we were feeling that 20 closest homes there is a pretty far distance. And we feel that 300 feet would be adequate. But it's up to you to decide whether you want to.
Well, I'm glad. So there's nothing to prohibit us from doing that in the areas that are zoned for larger parcels.
That's correct.
Or in an area that's got a specific zoning, you could do that with your automation and reach out and reach a broader circle. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Barnwell.
What is our solution to the Hillside dilemma?
The solution is that we will still require the 20 closest net tenant noticing requirement when it's called for, and also the 20 closest homes analysis in some cases where our boards are asking for that to be also submitted. So we feel that there is a sufficient noticing occurring.
So the Hillside properties will stick to the old thought process of 20 closest, and the others will be the 300-foot radius?
No. What I'm saying is that there is a standard 300-foot distance that what we want as staff is not to have to customize each notice. And you are correct that it may be an instance where you don't get the 20 closest homes noticed if we stick to the 300-foot radius, depending on the type of configuration of the lot.
Okay, but you are saying then that the data collection process to do comparative floor area ratios, et cetera, will still include the 20 closest? It
may include it. It depends, because what we found is that when you have a guideline approach, that is not necessarily a requirement for the 20 closest homes. It's based on the 85% rule. If you're over 85%, you have to get the 20 closest homes FAR analysis. And most of those parcels aren't meeting the 85 because of the size of the lot, FAR. In some cases they are, and then we do trigger that requirement. So it's a sort of a off and on.
Well, to go back to your thought process of the guidelines and versus requirements and regulations, I'll do what Ms. Baker just did a moment ago, go all the way back to the discussions of the committee. It was quite clear to me, having attended every single one of those meetings, that the committee's struggling with this was based on one concept, and that is notify the people who are affected. And don't try to create a rule where you're sliding under and not notifying someone who is affected. Thus, we came up with these numbers because, remember, we looked at a lot of city blocks and we talked about it. So I want to be sure that whatever this new verbiage is here still recognizes that that's where we're coming from. Everybody gets notified that ought to be notified, even slightly. And then insofar as the tenant issue, you used the phrase, and I think maybe you just misspoke, Ms. Baker, but you said the hand-delivered to the 20 closest tenants. It's not the 20 closest tenants, it's the 20 closest properties that have tenants in them? I mean, if you had a 20-unit apartment building, surely you're not going to give notices to 5 of those people because they're closer and the other are not closer. So how...
It would be the 20 closest parcels, all the occupants of the 20 closest parcels.
Okay. And then, I guess it's a question for Mr. Vincent, but why are we so flat-footedly positive about our requirements for the mailed notice, and then we have weasel language with requirements to the handing out notice? What's the difference there? Is it just because the Postal Department's part of the U.S. government or something? Or?
Mr. Vincent, identify weasel. No.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the mailed notice language is, the reason why the mailed notice language is so structured is that it's tailored after the government code provisions regarding required notice. The reason why you see different notice language for the alternative solutions, these are things that the city has come up with, and one, they're not required by state law. They are our own creation, and in our creation, we made some balances, and we left also opportunities to come up with new noticing methods, and we wanted to leave that opportunity open. So if staff comes up with a different type of noticing, that I would give an example of the on-site posting of notices. It was something that we came up with, and we thought, hey, that's a good idea. We wanted to leave the opportunity for additional noticing methods. If staff thinks of a new way to approach noticing, we left that opportunity open. But again, these are noticing requirements that are not required by state law. They're not required in order to meet the minimum due process requirements. They are additional noticing methods.
Chair Falcone, if I might add, I think I recall in a specific discussion at one of the groups, steering ordinance somewhere, that if somebody put the bright yellow sign out one day and then somebody else came by and took it, that results in an immediate need to continue the item because it's now been misnoticed. And so then you go and you put it out again and try to get on another agenda, and then it was gone again. So I think it was very intentional for the reason that Mr. Vincent is saying, that we could come up with new ideas and they might vary depending on the nature of the project, but it was also because this is a little less reliable, where the city is clearly responsible and there are too many unknowns or outside influences where we would not be able to confirm. However, isn't it not true, Heather, that in certain projects of a certain size, the applicant has to turn in information about actually having had a meeting with neighbors? And so, we get confirmation that not just a good faith effort, but, that this is really being done. We do confirm and check those things, but not to the level of where it can then bump you off an agenda. So that's how I recall it.
Yeah,
Madam Chair, I really want to echo what Ms. Weiss just said, and she hit exactly the reason why the weasel language is there, which is because the city is not in control at that point. The city cannot guarantee that the posted sign will be there every minute of every day, and we didn't want to undermine the legality of a notice and have somebody come back and say, the notice wasn't there for the hour that I drove by. And I can give you a perfect example of this. Plaza de la Guerra has had a sign intermittently located on it advising people of proposed development considerations.
The word there is proposed.
Proposed, but the key word I want to say is intermittent, because I see it every day, and there have been days where the sign wasn't there and then it was replaced. And so it's this recognition of good faith efforts, but also recognizing that these are in public locations that are not going to be under control of even the property owner. Wouldn't necessarily be able to prevent somebody else from taking the sign away and then coming back and arguing, wait a minute, you didn't provide the proper noticing. So I really wanted to echo Ms. Weiss's comment.
All right. Very quickly, Mr. Barnwell, question?
Well, just Can we go back just 1 second? This is a little dilemma I have occasionally. It says in there, the city may also require notice. Is this an option, and at whose discretion? Line 2.
Mr. Vincent.
In addition, the city may also require notice of hearing to be provided. Again, and I want to just footnote this, the Planning Commission 7-0, for the 7 or 8 years I was on it, all of them uniformly felt that this was an important thing to do, to notice, to hand things out. The council also felt the same way. And yet the document here says may.
Thanks. Madam Chair, I can tell you why that was put in there, because I wrote it. And it's may because of what I just explained earlier, that the city may choose to have different noticing methods. Staff has heard from the Planning Commission, staff has heard from the design boards, and is doing the posting notices. And it's continuing to do it. And to answer your question regarding whose discretion, it's the administrative discretion of the department, how they implement this particular section. They've been doing that consistent with the expectations of the boards and commissions.
Okay.
The reason why the word may is there is that if staff comes up with a new mousetrap, a new thing that the sign, they found that the signs really work, but there's some other way of also noticing, they may choose to use that methodology as well.
All right.
Madam Chair.
I'm partial to owls. They seem to work for Harry Potter, so I don't know. Heather?
Yes, just to remind the Commission, this item is not actually on the agenda for changing today. It's the language is staying the same. We have not encountered any problems with this. We have affidavits that applicants sign. We have guidelines and handouts which are very clear about when the noticing is required. So if you're suggesting a change, maybe we could do that after we get through the ones that are on the table today.
Okay. Mr. House, we have public comment as well, and then our own comments.
Just to chime in on this, as I recall, we were also attempting to reach tenants, not just the owners. The owner's requirement is required to be fulfilled with mailing out of the notices to the owners of the properties, which may not be resident in Santa Barbara. And we wanted to really encourage this truly good faith to reach out to the neighbors that are living near tenants or owners, either way. But we didn't want to make that a requirement. And I mean requirement in the sense of that it would hold up the person moving forward in their project. So we discussed it it was either at council or here at Ordinance, and I think we settled it there. I'm not one favoring us bringing it back again. I think we're okay with what we have. I wanted to see a track record after the first year or whenever we do that review and see how it's working.
After 2 years, I
thank you.
believe it is. All right. We need to move on, Ms. Baker. Number 8.
Change 8 is regarding triggers of projects to Planning Commission. We were careful to remove the Architectural Board of Review trigger to Planning Commission. Obviously, the ABR has changed to SFDB, and we didn't carry forward that provision into the Single Family Design Board. Basically, in the past, if a project was over 6,500 square feet, or if it had more than 500 cubic yards of grading, then it would be referred to the Planning Commission. And there's a couple other special conditions about Hillside Design District as well. The idea was that the Planning Commission wanted to be free to focus on other larger types of projects with different aspects. And so to free their time, we deleted that provision of a referral for the SFDB, and we intended to delete that referral for the Historic Landmarks Commission, and so we're just doing that now at this point. So
Number 9.
So we're in the simple cleanup items at this point, so these hopefully will go faster. Okay, change 9 is expiration of approval. We had intended for the 2-year expiration of approval to apply similarly to all 3 of the boards, the HLC, the SFDB, and the ABR. So this simply makes that consistent among the 3 design review hearing bodies. Okay.
Can you please?
Change 10 is regarding the NPO findings. The grading and vegetation removal findings were previously located not right adjacent to the NPO findings, so just for ease of the ordinance navigation, we've simply moved those findings to be adjacent to the NPO findings. And then we had our Eagle Eye reviewer, Jan Hubble, found just a very minor minor problem with one of the findings as far as it had the word "in" twice in it, and so we took that out because it was unnecessary. So I don't see it marked on here, but one of them just changed to have that word taken out. Okay, so anyways, it doesn't change the meaning. It's the same meaning, just a new location. Okay, change 11 is the sign review appeal scheduling. What happened is that we changed to an every other week schedule of the ABR because the Single Family Design Board is now meeting every other week as well. And so having that appeal hearing scheduled within 14 days was becoming a little bit cumbersome. And so instead it's just going to be at the first available meeting of the ABR or HLC as applicable. So just simply.
And 12.
Okay, 12. Was non-conforming buildings. Basically, we had a provision that if you had a legal non-conforming as to size at the time the ordinance was adopted in May, so for example, you have a house that's over the maximum required floor-to-lot area ratio at the time that the NPO was adopted. It was legally built that way. We gave a provision that would allow a little bit of wiggle room, per se, to add 100 square feet, say an additional bathroom or closet or something like that, without having to get a planning commission modification. It seemed a reasonable provision to provide some flexibility for those homeowners. We had meant for that provision to apply also to those projects that are requiring a modification because they are over the 85% and over 25 feet tall at the same time, because those projects trigger a mod. So those projects now would be allowed that 100 square foot one-time expansion with this change. And that's the last change, number 12. Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much. Unless you have something on that? All right, Mr. House?
I just have a question. If you go back to 8 for just a second, I wanted to, if I understand, the change is to make sure to add HLC. We're not, I know this may have a concern about this, but we're not renewing the discussion of what whether it goes to Planning Commission or not for ABR. We're just adding HLC to it. What is the appeals process if there were an issue at ABR? It goes right to council. Am I correct?
For SFDB, you mean?
Yes.
Right.
Oh, it goes. Well, no, I'm talking about the. Let's see, the exemption from Planning Commission review that have been reviewed by ABR. Okay, you're adding HLC to that, and the exemption from Planning Commission review now will be for HLC. And then if at HLC or ABR somebody wanted to take issue with that and appeal it, it would be appealable to City Council, correct?
The reason why I'm clarifying single-family design board is because we do still have some projects left at the ABR, and they're treated differently. So we need to be very careful about specifying which board and how the processing would go for those. But for the single-family design board, where the majority of the projects are going, those appeals would go to the City Council, and they wouldn't have a planning commission review unless there was a coastal development permit or some other environmental issue.
Oh, that's right,
involved.
because this number 8 is talking about the ones that are in that transition kind of period, right? I mean, am I correct about that? The ones that are still left over?
No.
Madam Chair, I can answer this quickly. We had just a project recently at the Planning Commission, only on the sole basis that it was over 6,500 square feet.
Like we used to do.
And it was a HLC application. And because the provision was still there, they had to go to the Planning Commission.
I see.
What we'd like to do is remove that so it doesn't go to the Planning Commission, similar to the SFDB requirement now, which it does not refer them based on size.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Baker. Now, public comment. I have a few. I'm going to start, though, by asking, Mr. Vincent, did you have anything remaining? No. I'm going to ask the chair of the Single Family Review Board, Design Board. Well, I think it's Single Family Housing Design Board. I don't know about designing single families, but never mind. Mr. Mahan, in the interest of time, I don't see a slip, but I'd like to call on you to make some comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Bill Mahan, Chairman of the Single Family Design Board. I just want to tell you that I feel the board is working really well. I think we've gotten our feet on the ground in the last 4 or 5 months that we've been operating. The guidelines are working very, very well. I support the polishing the guidelines and getting them better, because there are all little things that need to be corrected, and we have a few bigger things that we're going to be talking about later. But for instance, yesterday we reviewed for the first time 2 subdivisions that we're sending comments to Planning Commission about, and we have no guidelines for subdivisions, and the board faltered a little bit, not knowing just exactly what to do and what to look at and so on and so forth. So we're going to have to work on that. But for the houses, I think it's really working well. I've had a lot of positive comments on the phone and personally from people that I don't know, saying they think it's working well. So I just wanted to share those thoughts with you.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
You.
I know that they are leaps and bounds where they could have been through your guidance and your leadership. So thank you, Mr. Mahan, again for your service. Mr. Bartlett, who serves on our Planning Commission, has a few comments on this issue. So, Mr. Bartlett, followed by Connie Hanna, and then Michelle Gibbons.
Well, this is quite timely because actually last Thursday, Planning Commission had its first single-family project because of the coastal development permit that sort of rose to this level, and it really, I think, brought forward a lot of sort of unanswered questions as a result of the updated MPO, and so maybe it's a good time to at least introduce those, although a lot of them are not really included in today's cleanup list, which I liken more to, arranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I think there's other questions that are bigger that we should maybe have for another meeting, but first of all, it became very apparent last week that we really need a clear definition between the difference between ordinance or required for lots 15,000 square feet and less, and what happens for the guideline projects that are over. I think right now staff is treating both categories exactly the same way with the same measure, and I think it's confusing for the applicants. So somehow I think a future consideration in the booklet would be good to really define what's the difference between ordinance and guideline, because we don't see it being treated differently. On the basement issue that was brought up today, I would like to hear from the Ordinance Committee how it evolved to end up so different than what we had done at the steering committee level. The reduction was greatly minimized. Previously it was based on the number of sides on the basement, how many sides of it were buried below grade, and now the most you can get is a 50% reduction if you have everything buried, and actually in that case it's a cellar, so you only get a 50% reduction for having a cellar. So I think something got lost in the translation from the 30 some odd steering committee meetings to when it came to ordinance committee and it got put into the book. So I think some future clarity on that would really be helpful. And also I think that in terms of definitions, basement should be defined the same way the building code defines it. The building code does not define a basement as a story, so I think going down this path of now calling basement stories is not good, and I think we should fall in line with the building department, because I think a lot of people are going to be confused, as you already mentioned. Grading, the other thing that came up last week, grading under the footprint of a structure is not counted, and yet if you try and use that dirt, we're trying to encourage people to dig in and reduce the mass, bulk, and scale on structures, but now if you use the dirt on site, it gets counted as grading, and it works against you, where if you put it in dump trucks and impact the neighborhood and haul it away, it doesn't count. So I think that is not a very green idea, and I think that's something for future consideration. Also, what happened last week on this particular project, it started out under ABR. It's been to ABR 3 times, and now it's being forced to change jurisdiction to the Single Family Design Board. Hopefully there aren't many of these cases, but I think that's real unfortunate for a project that's gone a year and a half down the pike, and now you're forcing them to go to a different board. I think ABR has the same ability to make findings, and I think it would be more fair to the applicant. And then I wanted to comment briefly on the wall height that was under discussion in the front yard. I think when you can build a 4,000 square foot single family residence behind the front yard setback with no design review, why are we triggering design review for a 6-foot wall that is behind the front setback? Something seems ludicrous here, so be careful, how much scrutiny you want to add to the board's workload. So, anyway, I think most of the other changes are cleanup and good things, but I think there's a lot of bigger picture items for a future list, and because of the project we saw last week, I thought it was important to point those out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett, and also thank you for your service. Connie Hanna, League of Women Voters, we have a formal letter from you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I'm Connie Hanna, speaking for the Santa Barbara League of Women Voters. As you know, the League has been following the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance update since the very beginning, and we've been very supportive of the changes. We reviewed today's staff report about the detailed changes that are needed, and most of them we support totally. There are just a couple of points, and since you have my letter, I'll call attention just to the things we had question about. The stories question is a very interesting one, as Mr. Bartlett said. We had a serious question that when you used the wording 2 or more stories, this implied that you were talking about 3 or 4 or 6 stories, even though they are not permitted. Mr. Limon has explained to me that the real requirement is not in the zoning, but it's the 30-foot height limit, and so you only can get 2.5, maybe 3 if you had very low ceilings. And so maybe it's all very well controlled, but I'm just wondering if we mislead somebody by saying 2 or more stories could be built. Regarding the change 3 and the walls, I think the League would want to support anything over 3 foot being examined and reviewed, because there are walls, fences that they have put in various locations around town that are just ugly and wreck the whole view of the street. So we would support a lower height limit for change 3. In change 8, we really were concerned. We don't understand the exemption from Planning Commission review for very large projects that have already been reviewed by the Architectural Board of Review. Our concern is that excessively large projects have such negative impacts on the neighborhoods that they should also go on to the Planning Commission. We think that the old NPO system of taking them to Planning Commission ought to remain in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hanna. Last speaker today will be Michelle Gibbons from the
Hello, Madam Chair,
Citywide.
Councilmember House, and Barnwell. Thank you. My name is Michelle Gibbons, and I'd like to just make a few comments. First, on change number 2. It's an interesting situation. I didn't quite understand it before I came in, and I have actually more questions now than I did before I walked in the door, as maybe we all do. But I'm a little concerned at what exactly will be reviewed. Will it be just the addition, or will it be other aspects of that property, and will that be a hardship on somebody who might be wanting to make a small first-story addition to a 2-story home that is already quite large? Okay. On change number 7, I have some concerns with the consistency there. I wouldn't object to changing it from 20 closest to 300 feet, but I do think that there might need to be some kind of scale for hillside lots so that we include it, make it 500 feet or 400 feet, whatever it may be. But I think it needs to be consistent, because if somebody's going around noticing their neighbors or also doing a 20 closest homes analysis, you might be contacting somebody that the city hasn't contacted. And that's sort of like finding out about a birthday party that you weren't invited to. You know, the city should provide that list to the applicant. Whoever they're noticing, the applicant should have that list, and those are the people that the applicant should also be noticing. And then also we know that, you know, when that hand notice is not going to hold up it's not really a requirement. I mean, it's a good faith effort, and I'm sure people do it on good faith, but it's not going to, as far as I understand, it wouldn't hold up a project if that hand notice didn't get delivered. And then finally, I appreciate the change in number 12. I appreciate that flexibility there, but I would comment that height reduction for larger properties sort of snuck up on me at the end. I don't know, I don't really remember it, but if a property is over 85% of the FAR, it's only allowed 25 feet, whereas it's been 30 all along. And so that kind of crept up at the end, and I know when the ABR reviewed it, they questioned that. And I think it affects design. You can design a larger house with a shorter roof, but you just need more pitches, and so it's more expensive, and it affects the design. So just a comment for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms.
Happy
Gibbons.
holidays.
You too. All right, it is back to the committee for comments and for ultimately wrapping this up to either send all or portions of this on to City Council. Mr. House.
I'll be really brief. I can go along with each of the changes that we have here as they're recommended. We may have some discussion about that, the fence thing, but I thought Mr. Bartlett's point was something to be of interest. As I was listening to staff's presentation, I was thinking, well, you could actually build a home up to that front yard setback. That's developable part of the property. And so now we're really talking about those refinements to the property after a home has been built and that there is a front yard. So if I'm okay with the 6 foot, and I think we have the requirement of 10 feet back. A wall wouldn't be higher than 3.5 feet, and then after that it can go up higher, and the 6 foot threshold is enough to capture those that would be the kind of in-your-face development that we would be concerned about. I would like to have staff get a hold of Mr. Bartlett's list for some future discussions. They're not on our agenda for today, but some of those points are worth our consideration. We also had a letter from Nils Hammerbeck, who talked about the basement issue and talked about a recommendation of 4 foot 6 inches rather than using the 4 foot recommendation. And he made these reasonings here. Let's see. There's I guess in some of the projects, the people want to see 8 foot plate heights are more sought after by developers and homeowners, and also due to the fact that exterior grade is as much as possible held below interior finish floor, which is interesting. Of course, they would do that. I would recommend adjusting the minimum height requirement to 4'6" rather than 4 feet. And I wanted to ask staff to just take a moment and respond to that, and just to test that out a little bit. What would you see as the loss or gain by following Mr. Hammerbeck's recommendation?
Madam Chair, Councilman Kraus, I think there's a combination of answers here. One is staff's approach, and then you can speak to Mr. Vincent's knowledge of how we adapted the ordinance. But staff's approach is that we did have at one point a proposal that had a fluctuating sort of scale to depending on the degree of the basement, how much it was dug in. And what we felt was that we needed to simplify that approach in order to not complicate it for the everyday user who wanted to get that discount. So we did get it simplified along the way where you could get a 50% reduction or 100% rather than a graduated type of discount for square footages. So, and when we spoke to our city attorney's office, I think he concurred that we could do that in a much easier way.
And that's not actually on the agenda for today to make that determination. That was part of the original ordinance.
Right. And so I think in this case, this architect felt that he saw the original draft and proceeded based on that assumption that it would be allowed to have more credit for this underfloor area, and felt that it was a change that negatively impacted his design.
Mr. Vincent.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I would echo that the intent of the change from the steering committee to what was ultimately adopted at council was intended to simplify the implementation of the ordinance. That resulted in some projects won't qualify for it where they may have qualified under the steering committee's proposals. This was one of the most challenging concepts to incorporate into this ordinance. And the biggest concern that I had, and our office recommended, our recommendation to the council regarding the steering committee's proposal, was it was based on the number of sides that were buried. And the concern there is that there could be gamesmanship in design that would ultimately lead to multiple sides in order to get credit where credit really wasn't intended. And so that was the reasoning for the recommended change.
All right, well, then maybe that's another one of those things that we'll look at in the 2-year period, and along with Mr. Bartlett's list, that may be something that comes up. Just a couple last things. Sharing the list with the applicant of the notification circle, who's in that circle. Are we doing that now so that they could be working from that list as well? We're using the automated system to send out. Do they get a copy of that?
Yes, they do get that copy. I think that there's some confusion with respect to which projects get the 20 closest homes analysis, and somehow that not being, done on every instance, every case, because it isn't required for every application. But when we do produce the map, that is available for the applicants to look at, and we do generate a 20 closest homes analysis for the people that do an FAR.
And that would be helpful to them to know who to go and
they do notice the tenants, closest tenants, based on that map.
Okay, thank you. And then just now, this is about the cellar basement thing. Just again, I think that the direction we would want to go is to encourage. And I've been surprised in Santa Barbara there's so few cellars. In other parts of the country, that's a normal, important part of the house. The recreation room is there, and it always surprises me. And I think we would want people, if they want to have more use, that's visually, that's really an aesthetic improvement to the neighborhood to have a lot of those activities underground or half down. But maybe it's an old conversation, and it would be interesting to see how we can continue to encourage that as opposed to discourage it. That's all. I can support this. Thanks.
Mr. Barnwell.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Well, I just want to say thanks again for picking away at this and trying to get this thing done. I know a month or so ago I congratulated Ms. Baker on being done with it, and I guess I was a little premature. We're probably never going to be done with it. I don't think I'm still quite satisfied with the basement cellar thing. And it kind of goes to what Mr. House is saying, and it goes to the idea that a house that's on the downslope. Well, let me go back again. I'll just repeat this ad infinitum. But we're looking to
Within the next 10 minutes.
We're looking to create visualscapes from the public street that match the quote Santa Barbara sensibility. And if it isn't visible, we kind of are not worrying about it too much. And so when we talk about a building that's on a downslope side, maybe in a canyon or something, where maybe the basement would not be visible to anybody on the street or anybody else, it maybe seems that they're being penalized, or that they're being brought under some review that they should be given, they should be cut more slack. But as Mr. Vincent says, it's such a complicated issue that I'm supporting what we've got now, but I don't think we've quite wrestled it to the ground. I want to go back, and I agree with everything that you've done, with the exception of the front wall. And these are my reasons, which isn't in the staff report, I don't think. If it is, I missed it. But the Single Family Design Board thought that it ought to be 3.5 feet. Correct? So they're the guys in the trenches, and many of them have been in the trenches for years, not just on this board but other boards, and they felt it ought to be 3.5 feet. That carries a huge amount of weight with me, notwithstanding the other niggling details that I'm going to bring up. But what is going to prevent the general public from coming in with a 5-foot, 11-inch wall?
Nothing.
Nothing. And so we've, again, created one of these arbitrary lines, and you just slide in under it. So I think Mr. House made a very salient point when he said, you can still do these things. We're just asking for a review of it. There's no prohibition. We're just saying we find this a sensitive area. I think everything we've ever done in the city of Santa Barbara with design guidelines is that there's a sensitive area between the public along the boulevard and the face of the private building. Also, it doesn't recognize a whole bunch of other things that was already mentioned, like the distance back of the house and, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm landing heavily on the side of the Single Family Design Board that felt that it ought to be 3.5. It's already in our code at 3.5. And also that we just create another line, an arbitrary line of 6 feet, and they're all going to be 5'10". And everything else you've got, though, I'm in favor of it. But that one, I would request, if we get to it, that I'll have to pull that out and vote against that, because I think it should be 3.5 feet. Notwithstanding the fact there's a 4,000 square foot house on the lot. That's not important. The important thing is, how is it impacting the street and the visual appearance of the parcel as you drive and or walk by? I don't care how big the house back there is. That's not germane.
Thank you, Mr. Barnwell. My few comments, thank you. I don't think we'll ever be finished with this because this is one of those ongoing processes. And as you work with it, you find out some things work, some things don't work, and we need to have the flexibility in our processes that we can actually come back and say, you know, this is doing wonderfully or this is not doing so wonderfully. We need to really take a look at it, and I know everybody's on board with that sentiment. We don't dig in our heels. We actually, you know, have the flexibility to make changes when they're necessary. One thing you could answer very quickly for me, and that is the issue of grading. Mr. Bartlett brought up that if you haul it off site, somehow it is less onerous for the builder than if you incorporate it back into the site. I can't fathom that that would be anyone's intent, or that is really what's going on. Why is he confused here? Because he's certainly more expert at it than I am.
Madam Chair, I think what Mr. Barnwell is implying is that the project could be construed as having excessive grading if, in fact, the quantity under the footprint is included as far as excavation purposes, and if you excavate it, somehow it's perceived as something better than if you relocate it and balance the grading on site. I think what we've done with the update is taken all that grading discussion away from the Planning Commission pretty much, and most of those projects that don't go to the Planning Commission when they have a grading quantity over 500 cubic yards are now going to the SFDB. And for the most part, those are our experts that define and look at that grading to determine whether it's appropriate. Unfortunately, you still have some older projects that are going to the Planning Commission, and from an environmental standpoint, staff has to point out that there is a lot of grading going on, and that is construed sometimes as in a negative light.
So at some time in the not-too-distant future, we're not going to have these discussions any longer because projects will either be at one board or another.
Except for the coastal development permits.
Well, except for the coastal, there is always the exception.
Right.
I mean, that's
the goal, to have it with one board.
But for the exceptions, the tax code would be 3 pages long, you see. So,
right.
You know, that's
right.
The other one that I have is the height of the wall. I understand completely what Mr. Barnwell is saying, and I respect that, and that may at the end of the day be the right answer, but I'm willing today to go with the 6 feet. My initial quandary remains, why do we want to look at everything at 6 feet if it's an allowable use? But I will let it fly for a while, and again, we're having a review in the not-too-distant future at the 2-year mark, and we'll see how that goes. And if it becomes too onerous, I'm sure we'll hear from Mr. Mahan and others that it's just not necessary. There are some bad apples, but most of them are pretty good, and we can revise that. If it's not working at all, then we'll have to review Mr. Barnwell's concerns and see if we need to lower it. But I think we can go with this today. The tenants being noticed, that's incredibly important to all of us. We had that discussion here at the Ordinance Committee. I remember last time this was all here. And so there's no way to really verify it legally. It's not a legal component, but we care about it deeply. And so we'd like to see that it be accomplished within all reasonable limits. 300 square feet, 500 square feet notification. I'm kind of in that place where I understand that 500 square feet in a neighborhood of 5,000 square lots is going to look very, very different and is going to create tremendous inconsistencies in neighborhood compatibility than 300 square feet in an area where you have acre lots or 9,000 square foot lots. So if there's some kind of a hybrid, as Mr. Lamone, you mentioned before, the 1A sort of exaction for a larger noticing area, if you could look at that, Mr. Lamone.
Is that direction to increase?
It is direction from me, at any rate, that you look at breaking out smaller and medium-sized neighborhoods with a smaller radius that makes sense, that you get the neighborhood compatibility aspect of it and the touching people who should know about it, concern that many of us have, but that in the larger areas that you spread that berth around a little bit more, because I think you'll get a better neighborhood compatibility issue out of that as well, as opposed to getting 4 people around an acre
Madam Chair,
Parcel.
we can show you maps that would reflect the different distances at when it goes to council.
Yeah, we only want to do something that makes sense with that. Okay. My last comment has to do with the basement cellar number of stories issue. Being an East Coast girl, I'm very comfortable with my internal definition of what is a cellar, as I'm sure Mr. House from the Midwest is as well. They don't have those out here. In 30 years I've been in and out of California, I don't know of any cellars that exist necessarily, unless it's filled with wine or something. But basement, on the other hand, is also a peculiar term to use on the West Coast, but it's different. And to intermingle them without very, very specific and clear definitions of what is one and what is the other is, I'm afraid, going to lead to tremendous confusion. Also, calling a basement a story, when you look from Cliff Drive up on the hill, you see why this dripping down aspect of what was called a basement needs to be called a story. You drive along shoreline, and there's a charming new little home that has a little basement in there that looks like a two-story home. Having something totally submerged underground is a different kettle of fish than having it dripping down a hill. I think we need a lot more work on this aspect of what is a basement, how defined, and what happened to the definition that was rolling around the committee level and the steering committee level. What is a cellar? Although I think you ask 10 people on the street in California what a cellar is, they're not going to know. And how do we define this, what should be considered a story and what shouldn't? Because a lot of two-story homes who are trying to get some underground space for either a rec room or parking are going to get caught up in this confusion of, oh, well, it's a three-story. This is a quagmire here that needs, there's a lot of knots in this rope, and we need to untie them. So I don't know what to do with this today. I suppose we could send it on, but I'm not comfortable at all with the way it's presented. So I need a motion. We have a minute and a half. Mr. House.
Madam Chair, I think today the best thing we should do, I feel, is that we should move this forward, and I'm going to separate out item 3, which had to do with the walls for Mr. Barnwell's benefit, and we'll take that separately. I think that the direction that we are having in this motion is to make sure we get that definition between cellar and basement clearly articulated and perhaps referenced almost redundantly in here somehow, so it's very clear to people who are reading it. So I move that we approve staff's recommendations that we send them to council for ratification, except for number 3, and we'll do that separately.
And I'll second that motion for Mr. Barnwell's benefit. Okay, we have a motion and a second for everything to move to council with the exception of number 3 as stated in the staff report. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes on unanimously. And then Mr. House.
I'll move item 3 as it is in our staff report, where the 6-foot height is reduced from the 8-foot height.
I'll second that. We have a motion and a second. Further discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
No.
Opposed? 2-1. Passes. And I hope maybe you can bring to council these items that you've heard a lot of discussion on with a little more clarification. Maybe we can work it out at that point. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.